Hello and welcome to DataCast Solutions Introduction to KNIME for the Data Analyst.
In Chapter 6, we're going to talk about accessing databases. If the files that you're trying to blend and merge aren't coming in as a CSV file or an Excel spreadsheet, you're most likely reading it in from a database. So let's talk about what you're going to need to make that happen. In the early versions of KNIME, they supported database readers through the database reader node. And of course there was a database writer, database update, or database delete, but we're talking about reading for right now. And this node works great when you know SQL. And frankly, if you are a strong SQL programmer, this is a node I would actually direct you to continue to use. It allows you to just run any select statement using joins, merges, any form of SQL that's accepted by your database engine, you could submit through KNIME. And when you're in the configuration section that we're going to walk you through for configuring KNIME to access a database, this version of the reader is known as the database legacy, because they have replaced it with a new version now. In the new versions today, KNIME supports, instead of database, they call them DB nodes. And it's a collection of them: DB connector, DB table selector, DB reader, and they have joins and group bys. And basically what KNIME has done with this set of nodes is take the data analyst who's not very familiar and technically literate with SQL and allowed them to learn how to access databases without being SQL savvy. So again, if you know SQL, I'd be more likely to stick with the legacy database, but if you're not familiar with it, then these are the nodes for you. I'm going to demonstrate both. In the configuration section, this is the current version. So in the database section, the JDBC drivers here are going to be called databases, and on the prior version, they'll be called database legacy. You'll install JDBC drivers depending on which one you choose. KNIME comes pre-set up right out of the box with support for a number of the most common databases. MySQL, Redshift, things like that. However, it won't come with Oracle, DB2, SQL Server, Postgres, most of the other databases that you're going to use and want to set up. All you need to do in order to be able to use KNIME is install the JDBC driver. And there are two locations where you'll install the JDBC driver, depending on whether you're using the database or the database legacy nodes. I usually install them in both so that I have the option of using both. And I'm going to walk you through setting up the JDBC driver for both. In order to install a JDBC driver, of course, you have to know where it is. Somewhere you have downloaded it from your manufacturer, from your database that you're trying to connect to. Now, for example, I'm going to drag on top of my workflow here a database reader. And when I configure the database reader, one of the first things it wants to know is which driver do I want to use. Do I want MySQL, Apache, Hive, AWS Athena? Like I said, a few of them come pre-delivered with it. If I don't have the database I want available, if you want to use SQL Server or Microsoft MySQL, etc., something that you don't have, all you have to do is install the driver. So to do that, I'm going to come up over here up onto the File menu, and I want you to just select the KNIME preferences. And when it comes up initially, these are all the different areas where you can establish preferences too. I want you to expand the KNIME node here. And there's going to be two areas. There are databases, and these are all the custom drivers you've installed, and there are the legacy databases. These are same thing, it's the same driver but not installed in the same place. I'm going to go ahead and start by installing into the legacy. So I'm going to add a file, and in my case I'm going to install Postgres because that's the database I have working on my machine, and Postgres is installed in my C drive, and I'm going to go to Postgres 10, and I installed the Postgres driver into the jar directory, so I'm going to have it install the 42.2. That's the most current directory. That's it. That's all I have to do. I can hit apply and close, and the Postgres driver is now available to me. I'll go back into the File menu once again and select Preferences. This time, however, I'll go into Databases. And now I'm going to install the same driver, but make it available to the database nodes as well. So again, I'm going to hit the Add button. And I'm going to give it a name. Postgres version 10. Okay. And then it wants to know what type of default it is. DB2, Hive, Impala, MySQL. This is a Postgres database. So they understand, and you enter the URL template for anytime someone creates a new database connection, this is a default string it's going to look like. Now I can give it a name. Again, Postgres v10. I can add a description. I'll let it find the driver class automatically for me by just adding the file. So I'm going to go right back to my C drive, into the program files, and down into Postgres, version 10, the jar file, and I'll add it here, and then I'll have it find the driver class. By clicking that button, it found the Postgres driver, and everything looks okay. I'm sorry, it's apparently not liking the little X up here. It doesn't like the space in between the ID. I'm just trying to understand why it wouldn't enable the OK button. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now I've got the Postgres driver available for both database options. So I'll apply and close, and I'm going to be able to work from here. All right. So let's go ahead and configure this legacy database reader that I've dragged up here. And I'm going to go ahead and tell it, in this case, that I want to use the Postgres JDBC driver. And you can see that it's put in the default Postgres. Now it's running locally, so I happen to know my database, the host is my local host instead of a server. And it always runs on port 5432, and my database name that I'm using for my examples here is called DBVD rental. So now right off the bat, for right now, I'm going to put some credentials in, but we're going to talk about credentials and all the options I have. So I'll put a user ID and a password, and then I'll say select star from my inventory table. And now the node is ready to be executed, so I'll go ahead and execute the node, and it ran just fine. There's the data from my database. I've got a film ID, a store ID, and an inventory ID, and the data last update. So this is just a sample database that I'm using, and I've got a few thousand records in my inventory. So that database reader works just fine. The issue, of course, you saw is that I went ahead and hard-coded the credentials into my database reader. KNIME provides 3 methods for storing database credentials in a workflow. None of them is unfortunately totally secure. Remember that since KNIME is open source, anyone can look at the encryption technology, and if they are really dedicated people, they're going to figure out how to unencrypt your passwords. I've actually chosen in many cases to use a third-party solution like AWS Parameter Store, where I fetch the password using an encrypted key, rather than storing the key inside of my database. But the 3 methods we're going to be able to use include the method you just saw, storing at the database connector level, and the password is permanently retained. Every time I open the node, the password will still be there. A second option I have is I can establish those credentials in a quick forms node. The password will also be permanently retained, but I can use it as a set of credentials in any other database node. So instead of changing the password in many different, in the database reader, database writer, database updater, I could store the password in one place and it'll be saved and used by all the nodes. So I'll show you how to do that. And then third, you can create credentials at the workflow level. Then every time the workflow is opened, the password must be refreshed. That way the password is not actually stored in the workflow, it's only used in the workflow. That's kind of useful until you execute your jobs in batch, because when you run your jobs like in a nightly batch cycle, you're going to have to pass a password on the command line to plug into those credentials, and now you've got clear text passwords sitting inside of memory and available for someone to see. Like I said, all three of these are not ideally secure versions, which is why I tend to go the AWS parameter store route. Alright, so I'm going to take the database node that I just configured, and I'm going to put in a new credentials input widget right here. And then I'm going to right click over here and configure it. And this is meant to be used in an interactive screen. Now I'm just going to use it here because it's simple for me to store it. So the label would actually be used when you're executing this on a KNIME server and you want somebody to enter database credentials. In my case, I'm going to enter some credentials right here, and the variable name I'm going to call it my Postgres credentials as a name. So now we're going to talk about flow variables. When I execute this, there's no output. I haven't read any data. What there is here, however, is it's referred to as a flow variable. We'll talk about that more in another chapter. But I'm going to connect this. If you right click over here, I'm going to ask it to go ahead and show the flow variable ports. This is not, I can connect this right here to the flow variable port that way. It means there's no data coming in here, but I want the output of this node to be available to this node. Now, that was not necessary. If I right click over here and hide the flow variable ports, you can just drag and connect the flow variable port. It knows it's there, so if I drag a line there, it will make the connection. You'll notice once I've made the connection, though, this went to yellow status. In other words, if something upstream of your workflow has been added, all the nodes downstream get reset because they have to be rerun now because something upstream may have changed it. Now I'm going to go into my database reader, and instead of hard coding my user ID and password, I'm now going to tell it to use credentials. And there's the variable name I gave it, Postgres credentials. And that's helpful for me because now I can execute that. I could also have a second database reader. So I'm going to do a Control-C and a Control-V and paste that node. And I'm going to do a second database read. And I'm going to do a select star from the film table. And I've closed that a little quickly. You'll notice I've left it as the Postgres credentials again. So when I execute this view, you see if I have to change my password, I only have to change it in one node. If you have 20 database nodes throughout your workflow, you're going to have to go change it everywhere. So this method allows me to store the database credentials in a single place. And again, there is a third option, and that is to store the credentials at the workflow level. So I'm going to remove these credentials right here from the workflow. And over here on my workflow, over on the left-hand side in the KNIME Explorer, I'm going to right-click over here, and I'm going to enter workflow credentials here. And I'm going to add one. And the name doesn't matter, it's just a name. I'm going to call it PostG, PostGRES. And the login ID. And I'll click OK. So now it is set up and available to me. And I'm going to save this workflow. And now when I open up the database reader, it defaulted, it recognized the one was gone, and it's given me the only database credentials, now Postgres. That's the only credentials that are available to me. If I hit execute all up here at the top, I'm going to run one. Sorry, this one needs to be updated to reflect the Postgres credentials to collect the right name. Now both of these are able to run. And I'm going to hit save here. And now I'm going to close this workflow. And now I'm going to reopen the workflow, and you'll notice the password is not set. It recognizes there are credentials when I reopen the workflow, and I'm not going to be able, if I click OK, that's fine, it'll open this up, but if I reset this workflow and try and execute that node, I get the server requested password, but none was provided. So this is okay. This is just part of normal behavior. So I have to right click over here, go into the credentials and tell it, no, I need the password here. And now I'll be able to execute that node again. So it's a method of storing at least the user ID and then forcing them to pass. So if you give this to someone else, if they don't know the password, they can't run it. The way I had written it before, if anyone else opened up your workflow, your user ID were hard-coded inside of the workflow, and they would be available to anybody else. They couldn't see your password, but they could use it. And that wouldn't be a good thing. So that's the legacy method. What you see, like I said, is very easy and straightforward because you understand that you can type any SQL statement. It's passing it through that database driver. So as long as the SQL I send is Postgres compliant, it's going to go to the Postgres database and everything is fine. But what if I don't know SQL and I'm not readily familiar with that? Well, what are my options then? Well, I'm going to go ahead and delete these two nodes, and instead I'm going to come up and start with, you notice if I just start with DB, there's all kinds of group bys and order bys and row filters and query filters. What these nodes all do are, they're meant to help people who don't know SQL execute SQL. So they don't know how to run the group by command. They don't know how to join two tables together, how to use the with or across command. So we help them with things like pivoting and row filtering because they don't know the where clause and they don't understand how to use like and subselects and so on. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to start by pulling in the database connector, and I'm going to go ahead and put this in here, and I'm going to tell it that the one I want to go at is Postgres. And this is my driver name, the ID. This is the URL again, and it's on my local host at port 5432, and my database is DVD rental. I am going to require credentials. This database doesn't come, and I'm going to choose for my credentials the one that I established already at the workflow level. Otherwise, I could specify user ID and password, of course. So I'll click OK, and when I execute that node, I'm able to connect to the database. That's wonderful. So the next thing I have to do now is select the table. So I'm going to highlight this, and this is another trick for inserting nodes. If instead of dragging and dropping and connecting the nodes together, if I just double click while this is highlighted, if I double click on table selector, it will just join the two nodes together. Fast way of building your workflow. So now I'm going to double click on the table selector here and tell it the schema. It was public and the table was inventory. Now again, if you know SQL, I'll let you skip by this process by clicking custom query, and you can just type in the SQL statement yourself. But again, they work under an assumption that you don't know SQL. So I could actually select a table by opening up the metadata of the database itself and saying, these are the tables that are in my database. So this is aimed at the user who's not sure what they're doing. So now I can execute this node. And now finally I'll go to the actual reader. So the one that will actually execute the SQL statement, and I just double click to connect that together. And now I don't even have to configure this because there aren't any parameters to be configured. That's why it came up yellow right away. So I'm just going to go ahead and execute it. And now there's the KNIME data available as well. So it's a few extra nodes. like I said, if you wanted to add group bys and say, all of these different features for people who don't know SQL. So again, if you're one of those people, if you're not a real strong SQL person, this is a great way of learning how to use the database without becoming an expert in it. For those of you who know SQL very strongly, I would urge you to just stick with the legacy nodes, because it's much, much easier, obviously, than dragging 3 nodes out here at a time. But that takes us through the process of reading data.
This concludes this chapter of the class. Feel free to move on to the next chapter.